In 1981, a Chinese ornithologist named Liu Yinzeng climbed into the Qinling mountains of Shaanxi province, expecting to confirm what the scientific community had already concluded. The crested ibis was extinct. He had been sent to document the absence, to close the file on a species that had vanished from China, Korea, Japan, and Russia over the previous 2 decades. What he found instead, in a single tree in a single mountain village, changed the trajectory of one of the most ambitious wildlife recoveries in Asian history. And what those 7 birds did to the mountains around them in the 40 years that followed is something no one in that village in 1981 could have predicted. Liu had spent 3 years preparing for this conclusion. He and his colleagues at the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences had trekked more than 50,000 kilometers across 14 provinces, searching for evidence that the crested ibis still existed. Every lead had gone cold. Every report had turned out to be a mistaken identification or an old sighting. By the spring of 1981, Liu had written the paper. Its title was straightforward and final. The crested ibis was extinct in China. Before submitting it, he requested one more field visit to Yangtze County, to the southern slopes of the Qinling Range, where a local forestry worker named Lu Baozhong had told him, without much conviction, that something matching the description had been seen near a village called Yaojiagu. Liu did not believe it. He went anyway. On May 23, 1981, in a stand of trees above terraced rice fields, Liu Yinzeng found 7 crested ibises, 2 breeding pairs, 3 fledglings, the last of the species anywhere on Earth, not just in China, but anywhere. He stood below the nesting tree and felt, by his own account, not relief, but fear. 7 birds, carrying the entire genetic future of a species that had once ranged from Siberia to the South China Sea in a single tree above a farming village that had no idea what lived in it. 4 days later, the Yangtze County government issued emergency protection orders. No hunting in the birds' living areas, no cutting of nesting trees, no use of chemical fertilizers or pesticides in the foraging zones, no explosives or firearms in the breeding areas. 4 people were stationed at the nesting site around the clock, watching the birds by day, guarding them from predators by night. The team spread butter on the trunks of the nesting trees to stop snakes from climbing. They kept records of every behavior, every feeding, every movement of every bird. What happened next in the Qinling Mountains took 40 years to fully understand. The crested ibis is a foraging bird. It wades through shallow water, flooded rice paddies, slow streams, marshy field margins, probing the mud with its long curved beak for loaches, frogs, freshwater crabs, and invertebrates. For the birds to survive in Yaojiagu, those foraging areas had to produce food. That meant the rice paddies around the nesting site had to remain as they were, traditionally farmed, without the chemical inputs that modern agricultural intensification had introduced across the rest of China's countryside. The pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that had become standard practice across rural Shaanxi killed the invertebrates the birds fed on. Where they were applied, the paddy fields became food deserts. Where they were banned, the fields stayed alive. The farmers of Yangtze County understood this before the scientists had fully mapped it. The local government's protection orders had banned chemical inputs in the birds' foraging zones from 1981 onward. Farmers who had begun transitioning to modern agricultural methods were asked to go back. Traditional cultivation, organic compost, manual pest control, no herbicides on the paddy margins. It was, in economic terms, a step backward. Lower yields, more labor, no access to the inputs that were increasing productivity everywhere else in China's rapidly modernizing agricultural sector. The farmers did it anyway. And what happened to the rice they grew is the part of the crested ibis story that the population numbers alone cannot explain. By the early 2000s, as the crested ibis population in Shaanxi had grown from 7 to several hundred, the county government recognized something that had been building quietly for 2 decades. The rice grown without pesticides in the ibis foraging zones was different from the rice grown everywhere else. Cleaner water in the paddies produced cleaner grain. The absence of chemical residues made the rice measurably purer than conventionally farmed alternatives. Consumers in China's growing urban markets were willing to pay a premium for food they could trust. Yangtze County began marketing its rice under a certification that linked it explicitly to the Crested Ibis Protection Program. Ibis-friendly rice became a brand. A bird that had been found on the edge of extinction was becoming the branding foundation of an agricultural economy. By 2021, Yangtze's ibis-certified organic products covered more than 32,000 hectares of farmland and generated billions of yuan in annual revenue. The farmers, who had been asked to farm without pesticides in 1981, were now farming without pesticides because it was more profitable than any alternative. The restriction that had initially looked like an economic sacrifice had become, over 40 years, an economic advantage. The bird had not just survived the agricultural landscape around it, it had restructured that landscape's relationship with the market. But the transformation running through the mountains was not only agricultural, it was ecological, and it reached far beyond the rice paddies. When the Yangtze government sealed the mountains around the nesting sites in 1981, prohibiting logging and restricting human activity across the bird's habitat, the forests on those slopes were already heavily degraded. Decades of fuel wood collection, agricultural expansion, and commercial logging had pushed the tree cover back from the valley floors. The streams that the crested ibis depended on for foraging were degraded, silted, disturbed, and stripped of the marginal vegetation that produces the invertebrate communities that wading birds feed on. Protecting the birds required protecting the habitat. Protecting the habitat meant letting the mountains recover. The forest grew back. Not quickly, forests never do, but measurably, decade by decade, as the restrictions held and the pressure on the slopes eased. The streams recovered their marginal vegetation. The invertebrate communities that the ibises fed on returned to paddy margins and stream edges that had been degraded for years. The habitat area that could support crested ibises expanded from less than 5 square kilometers in 1981 to more than 16,000 square kilometers by 2022, an increase of more than 3,000 times, not because anyone planted that habitat, but because the protection that saved the bird also gave the mountains the space they needed to rebuild themselves. Zhang Junfeng, a scientist at the Shaanxi Provincial Rare Wildlife Rescue Base at the northern foot of the Qinling Mountains, began working with the captive breeding program in 2002, when 60 birds were transferred to the facility from Yangtze. Her task, as she described it, was simple and enormous at the same time. Let the birds reproduce as fast as possible to ensure the species' survival. The captive breeding program applied reproductive technologies developed through years of trial and accumulating failure, and it used artificial incubation, hand-rearing protocols, and disease prevention measures that had not existed when Liu found the 7 birds in 1981. By the time Zhang's team had fully refined the program, the Shaanxi base was producing hundreds of birds each year. The facility raised more than 500 birds, and it released more than 140 into the wild. 6 artificial breeding bases were established across the country, using animals supplied from Shaanxi. The expertise developed at the rescue base became the technical foundation for every subsequent crested ibis reintroduction in China, in Japan, and eventually in South Korea, where the species had been extinct since the 1970s. The numbers that came back from the wild tracked the captive program's output, with a lag that reflected the slow biological clock of a species that matures at 3 years and raises at most 1 clutch per season. 7 birds in 1981, hundreds by the late 1990s, more than 1,800 by 2013, more than 9,000 by 2022, more than 10,000 by 2024, with 7,700 of them in Shaanxi province alone. The habitat that had shrunk to a single valley in the Qinling Mountains now extended across the province and beyond. Reintroduced populations had been established in Zhejiang, Henan, and other provinces. China had exported birds to Japan and South Korea, providing the genetic foundation for reintroduction programs in countries where the species had been gone for decades. Liu Yinzeng, the ornithologist who had spent 3 years walking 50,000 kilometers across China to confirm that the crested ibis no longer existed, lived to see the population exceed 10,000. He had submitted his extinction paper and then, before filing it, asked for one more field visit. That decision, made not from scientific certainty, but from something closer to reluctance to close a door, produced the discovery that changed everything. He described the moment of finding the birds in the nesting tree above Yaojiagu not as triumph, but as the beginning of a different kind of fear. 7 animals, the whole world's supply of a species that had flown above East Asia for 60 million years. Whether they could survive depended on decisions made in the days, months, and years that followed by people who had never planned to be conservation managers, farmers, local officials, forestry workers, and a team of scientists who drove to a village in Yangtze County on a hunch. There is a rice paddy in Yangtze County, Shaanxi province, where crested ibises forage in the morning mist above traditional fields farmed without pesticides since 1981. The farmers who work those fields earn more for their rice than conventionally farmed neighbors because the absence of chemicals imposed on them 40 years ago has become, in a market that values clean food, a competitive advantage. The mountains above the paddy have more forest cover than they did in 1981. The streams that feed the paddy have more invertebrates in them than they did when Liu Yinzeng climbed past them toward the nesting tree. 7 birds in a single tree above a village that did not know what they were. What the mountains look like today is what 40 years of decisions made around that tree produced. That is not a fairy tale. That is what 10,000 crested ibises and 40 years of documented conservation science look like across 16,000 square kilometers of northwest China. And it is what a single ornithologist's reluctance to file his extinction paper made possible. But China is not the only country where the discovery of a species on the absolute edge of extinction set in motion a transformation that reached far beyond the animal itself. In our next video, we travel to Japan, where the same 7 birds, exported as a diplomatic gift between 2 governments, landed on a small island in the Sea of Japan and triggered an agricultural revolution that nobody in the reintroduction program had planned for. If you thought 7 ibises rebuilding the mountains of northwest China was unexpected, wait until you see what the same species did to the rice economy of Sado Island. You will not look at conservation the same way again.